There's a saying that everything is a copy of a copy of a copy. Let's have a conversation. Today we're diving into something really strange in gaming. Video game cover arts that look very similar to each other. Before we get into the examples I want to cover, I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about games sharing a genre or using familiar imagery. That is very difficult to avoid, because certain styles naturally come with certain visuals. And over time those visuals become a part of how we recognize what game we're looking at, especially if we know nothing about it. What I'm interested in is moments where two covers go beyond that, where the composition, the pose, the mood, and even the framing feels so close that it stops looking like a coincidence and starts raising questions, or at least fuels internet discourse. So before I get started, I just want to show you some examples that have generic similarity. For example, Red Dead Redemption and Call of Juarez, The Cartel. Now, everyone knows Red Dead Redemption is basically GTA in the Wild West. You play as John Marston, who tries to leave his past behind and hunt down his old gang members to save his family. But Call of Juarez The Cartel, which is the third game in the Call of Juarez series, is set in present-day Mexico and the US, where players take on the role of law enforcement officers and vigilantes in a war against violent drug cartels, as the name implies. So this is an example of a similar genre. Both Call of Juarez The Cartel and Red Dead Redemption 1 have a Western genre, so it makes sense why the box art would be similar thematically. But I guess it is a bit odd that both characters have a double-barreled shotgun facing towards you on the cover art. But moving on to my generic example 2, Left 4 Dead and Dead Space 1. Both of these I guess you can categorize as survival shooters. Again, Left 4 Dead, everyone knows about this, a cooperative zombie shooter where you have 4 survivors trying to escape hordes of the infected, relying on teamwork and strategy. And Dead Space 1, which got a remake recently. Dead Space 1 is a sci-fi horror game set on the derelict mining spaceship, the USG Ishimura. You play as Isaac Clarke, a control engineer, and fight against necromorphs, which are what the enemies are called in this game. This is another generic example because both of them are horror games and you're trying to survive. And as you can see, both of them have a hand on the front cover. Similar, but not like the examples we're going to get into later on. The third and final generic example, you get it by now, Metro 2033 and Stalker Call of PRIPYAT. Both of them post-apocalyptic shooters set in Eastern Europe. In Metro 2033, you play as Artyom, a survivor in the nuclear-ravaged Moscow where you fight mutants and hostile factions. In Stalker Call of Pripyat, you play in the Chernobyl exclusion zone after a second fictional disaster. You scavenge for supplies, battle mutants, and navigate hostile human factions. Again, both of these games are thematically similar since they both are post-apocalyptic shooters and feature someone wearing a gas mask on the cover art. Now we're going to venture into cover arts that I think go beyond generic and thematic similarity, which could be a coincidence, but I'll let you decide, and especially one case that led to legal dispute between major publishers. Let's take a closer look. The first example we have is Spec Ops: The Line and Insurgency Sandstorm. This is the comparison that inspired this entire video, because I kept getting confused between both of the games. Both covers have a lone soldier facing the viewer with a weapon in hand. The framing and the posture seems very similar in both of these cover arts. There's a helicopter that's in almost the same position on both of the covers, which is interesting. In terms of the games, Spec Ops: The Line is a third-person shooter set in Dubai, exploring psychological trauma, moral ambiguity, and the consequences of war. Whereas Insurgency Sandstorm is a tactical first-person shooter focused on team-based realistic modern combat with cooperative gameplay. So these games are very different from each other, but the covers look so similar it's easy to imagine that the same person could have made both. Next we have The Day Before and The Last of Us Part 2. The original Last of Us Part 2, not the remastered one. Who can forget The Day Before, the infamous most wishlisted game on Steam? It was an extraction shooter, so you would go into an area where other players also are and try and get some loot. And Last of Us Part 2, a game that the internet does not like, from what I understand at least. You play as Ellie in The Last of Us Part 2, which is a narrative-driven action-adventure game, following on from the events of The Last of Us Part 1. Again, another example where the games are drastically different in what you do as a player, so the gameplay. One of them required an online connection while the other didn't. But their covers both show the protagonist, at least in the case of The Last of Us Part 2. This is one of the comparisons I stumbled across while doing research for this video. I saw someone say it on Reddit and I was like, yeah, I can see that. Okay, next we have Battlefield 2042 and the CRYSIS trilogy, or even CRYSIS 2, but we'll go with the CRYSIS trilogy. So both of these games are set in the future and have a futuristic soldier on the cover art in high-tech gear centered in the frame. The reason why these games are here is because of the buildings in the background. The skyscrapers look very similar on both cover arts. Battlefield 2042 is a large-scale multiplayer shooter, which had a really bad launch due to many bugs and missing features, whereas the CRYSIS trilogy are sci-fi action games, where players control soldiers equipped with nanosuits that give you superhuman abilities. And also these CRYSIS games have a campaign or a story mode, something which Battlefield 2042 lacked. Again, these are different games, one is a multiplayer game, one is a single player game, but the covers look very similar in the way that they are styled. It's hard not to notice. The next example is again one that I came across on Reddit. I saw both of them and I was like, yeah, I can see the similarities. Silent Hill 2 Remake and Last of Us Part 1, the remake. I understand this example might be a bit out there for some people, but I thought it deserved a spot in this video. Both of them are remakes, but the similarities don't just end there. Both of them have a key character that is bigger in the background, where you can see the top half of their body, and another character that's sort of a lone figure, smaller in the middle. Now, talking about the game, Silent Hill 2 is a psychological horror classic about guilt, trauma and personal loss, where you play as James Sunderland going into a fog-covered town known as Silent Hill. And Last of Us Part 1, which everyone knows about at this point due to the many remakes and remasters, is a story-driven game. You play as Joel, who comes across Ellie in a post-apocalyptic world. To put it very simply, so both of these games have very different stories, but the visual approach to these covers feels very similar. Now we're on to two cover arts that I found during my research that was so similar it actually led to legal dispute between the publishers. These are Baja Edge of Control and Score International Baja 1000. So what happened was, in 2008, THQ accused Activision Blizzard of releasing Score International Baja 1000, the official game, with cover art that looks almost identical to Baja Edge of Control. THQ argued that the similarity could confuse customers, especially since Edge of Control had already been heavily marketed, with over $1 million spent on promoting its cover art alone. Both the games were very similar in gameplay as well. Both of them featured desert racing. Baja Edge of Control focused on off-road racing with realistic vehicle handling on harsh terrain. Score International Baja 1000 is officially licensed, based on the annual Mexican off-road motorsport race, held in Baja California in Mexico, that featured long-distance events and multiple vehicle classes. The issue wasn't just the theme, it was the execution. Both covers showed off-road vehicles in the sand at similar angles, using extremely similar composition, colors, and the sense of motion. THQ filed a lawsuit in the US District Court for the Central District of California, seeking damages and attempting to block the game's release. This argument centered on consumer confusion and visual similarity. However, the court didn't immediately stop the sales, apparently because THQ hadn't formally registered the copyright for the cover art, and eventually the case was settled out of court. But as a part of that settlement, Activision Blizzard agreed to change the cover art for Score International Baja 1000, and THQ dropped the lawsuit. So this is the revised cover art, and because of this, two different versions of the game's cover art exist in circulation today. It's one of the rare cases where the cover art alone caused the major publisher to act, with legal action no less, highlighting just how important these covers can be. So why does any of this matter? Well, in my personal opinion, video games are a creative medium, and I feel like the box art of a video game is also another way to express that creativity. A cover art isn't just decoration, it's the first impression a game makes on the player, especially when you don't know anything about the game. And publishers know this, they spend a huge amount of money crafting these images, and when two covers look too similar, it can create confusion between the player base or dilute a game's identity. Most of the time, similarities come down to shared genres and familiar visual language, but every now and then, the overlap becomes noticeable, enough to spark debate, or in rare cases, even legal action, as I've just shown you an example of. The cover art of a game is its visual identity, and a key part of how publishers communicate with the players. Paying attention to these details gives you a new perspective on how much thought and strategy goes into shaping a game's identity before you even pick up the controller. So if you can think of any other game cover arts that look a little too similar, let me know in the comments. I'm sure there are more that I've missed. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching.